Hello and welcome to World Talks. I'm Diana Skaya. With the peace negotiations over the Russian war on Ukraine underway, a Russian leader rolled out his strategy to deal with US President Donald Trump. Now, Vladimir Putin took 8 hours to present piling conditions and delays onto ceasefire talks, nothing of which being acceptable for the Ukrainians. But now, which of these Russian demands should never be accepted by the American negotiators? And are all these parallel efforts by the American side and EU allies still aligned? Well, to break it all down, we're joined by Rear Admiral retired Mark Montgomery, Senior Director, Center on Cyber and Technology Innovation. Sir, so happy to have you here with us on World Talks on TVP World.
Thank you for having me today.
All right, let's go with the latest. So my question to you here now, will U.S. attacks on positions in Yemen be those first rifts between Russia and Donald Trump's administration?
Well, I think it depends how deeply the United States goes in these strikes. So historically, we've just struck Houthi positions. If we really want to change the if we want to prevent further Houthi attacks, we eventually have to hold the Houthi sponsor, Iran, accountable, which really means we have to hit Iran. We have to hit their ships that are doing targeting for the Houthis, and we have to hit their ports and factories that are making parts and equipment for the Houthis. If we do that, that will be a pretty big breach between the United States and Russia, because Russia sees itself as an ally of Iran after all of Iran's strong support to Russia in the war with Ukraine with Shahed drones and such.
Let me take you through here what UK Prime Minister Keith Starmer said. He said now the coalition of the willing is now moving to an operational phase with their goal of having a just and lasting peace. Now, sir, with everything that's been going on, even today, we're seeing Donald Trump cutting, funding even now for freedom of the press. But now, what is the goal of the U.S. administration with everything put together?
Well, I think the U.S. administration is trying to drive a peace, a settlement, a cessation of hostilities. I think they're driving too fast, and they're driving too hard on the Ukrainians in this case, and not on the Russians. I think Prime Minister Starmer is doing the right thing, working with his European allies to bring agreements together on potential troops for a peacekeeping force. But from my perspective, I think that the United States needs to bring more pressure onto Russia, a maximum pressure campaign onto Russia. And I just haven't seen President Trump do that yet.
You just mentioned, sir, that, too fast and too hard. But let me ask you this now. Why aren't we seeing Trump putting as much pressure on Russia and on Putin in the same ways that we've seen, we've witnessed in the weeks, in these past few weeks, having put all this pressure on Zelensky?
That's a great question. He should have. In fact, the minute his emissary, Steve Witkoff, left the Kremlin with an answer of I like your idea, but here are 8 hours of conditions, some 30 conditions. He should have immediately begun to squeeze the Russian shadow fleet. He should squeeze the ability of the Russians to sell oil and natural gas. Without those fossil fuel sales, the Russian economy won't work. We know how to bring Russia to its knees, stop its sales at the secondary and tertiary sites, enforce sanctions against the shadow fleet. If you do that, you force Putin into a tough decision. His economy operates, from a plurality at least, on these fossil fuel sales. And he does two things with his money. 40% of it goes to the Russian military to fight the war. 60% of it goes to his support network, the babushkas and everyone else who he buys votes from. If you lower his amount of money, he has two choices: stop fighting the war or stop paying off his base. Either one of them puts him in extremis. So we know how to do a maximum pressure campaign. Donald Trump just not doing it.
Right. I mean, Mr. Montgomery, so you mentioned here two really important factors here. I mean, again, pressure in a collective campaign now. But I mean, before that, you talked about, 8 hours of all these preconditions. I mean, what are the key takeaways here? What should we pay attention to within these 8 hours of all these piled up conditions?
So first, I think Putin's buying time. Rightly or wrongly, he thinks the Kursk, the holding of Kursk by Ukrainian soldiers is coming to an end. I think he's probably wrong that it's going to end rapidly, but he thinks it might. So he will delay until he has ejected the Ukrainian forces from his territory, and that's not part of the negotiation, the formal negotiations he goes into. So that's number one. Number two, he knows that we appear to want this more than him. It's always dangerous to negotiate with yourself, for us to negotiate with the Ukrainians in public, force them to make concessions, then turn to Russia and ask an autocrat who's brazenly invaded another country to give his concessions. Of course, he's not going to do that. I mean, he's a thug. We should treat him like that. And what that really means, as I said, is a maximum pressure campaign that punishes him, that holds him accountable for what he's done, and forces him to the negotiating table in better faith.
Admiral, let me ask you about what can you tell us? I mean, the Ukrainian president has appointed today a new chief of general staff, Brigadier General Andriy Ignatov. What do we know about him? What should we know about him? And would this actually shift possibly the course of this war?
Okay, I think he was the deputy chief of staff ahead of this when I last saw him. So I don't think this is a significant change. I think he probably has a level of frustration with his current commander, and honestly, all these commanders have been in such sustained combat for 36 months. You probably do need some rotations. But I imagine there's a level of frustration. Now, look, what's wrong in Ukraine is not the Ukrainian army. They're fighting as well. They could do some things a little better, but the truth is they're fighting heroically and well. What the problem is, they're short on some of the critical assets they need. Long-range fires, which are called ATACMS weapons and HIMARS weapons from the United States, one of which were just in short supply no matter what, and the other was temporarily held back for, about 10 days. These have impacts. He's short air defense weapons. They're called NASAMS or AMRAAM missiles for the NASAMS launchers, and Patriot missiles for the Patriot launchers. Those just aren't in good supply in the United States, and the ones that were coming were held up for 10 days. These are not the problems of the Ukrainian army. These are political problems caused by Donald Trump and caused by our defense industrial base not being ready for this kind of war, and certainly the European defense industrial base being nowhere near ready. So again, I don't blame the Ukrainian army for the position they're in, and I don't blame the outgoing chief of staff, and I don't think they'll get much difference in the new chief of staff, the deputy.
Starmer also, if we just could go back to him for a moment, he criticized Putin for not doing enough and says we can apply collective pressure on Putin. We're talking about the European Union, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Sir, what should the coalition do to actually apply active pressure, in your opinion?
They're not going to do what they really could do, which is cut off all fossil fuels coming from Russia. I mean, that would harm their economies. That would leave their people cold or hot, depending on the time of the year. And there are limits to what they're willing to do. Rhetoric will only take you so far. But they can join us in these sanctions against secondary and tertiaries on the shadow fleet going outside of Europe with fossil fuels. And most importantly, they can start to put together a peacekeeping force. And you can tell how much that infuriated the Russians. I think former President and Prime Minister Medvedev came out and immediately criticized this plan and said it's a non-starter. It's not a non-starter. When there is a cessation of hostilities, there will be 10 to 20,000 peacekeeping troops in there, and the vast, vast majority are going to be from NATO states, and Russia's going to have to eat that. That's going to be one of the terms of this. I have to be clear. Russia will not get to dictate who's in the forces that guarantee the security. The United States is going to dictate that, and it's going to be European countries.
Let me ask you now, let's go here for a moment back to Mike Waltz's TV interview that he gave, saying, is it realistic to drive every Russian off of every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea? What is your view on this?
Look, Mike Waltz is a realist. I'm not thrilled with what he and Secretary Rubio done in terms of forcing the Ukrainians to make concessions ahead of a meeting with Russia. I think that's inappropriate, and it's certainly inappropriate with your ally. But Mike Waltz is speaking the truth. The truth is, as conditions sit today, Ukraine cannot eject Russia from Crimea. What they need to do is eventually get a cessation of hostilities on acceptable terms, and wait for the inevitable fall of Putin. Once you get at some point, there'll be a more realistic government in Russia where they can have that discussion. It's not today. It may not be this decade, but eventually they can redress this. They're not going to be able to redress it in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 months leading into a cessation of hostilities.
So you really think it's going to take that long? I mean, and you're also saying acceptable terms. What kind of acceptable terms are we talking about here?
So I think to get Russia to the terms that everyone else can reasonably accept, Ukraine, United States, and Europe, to get to the kind of terms we could accept, which is a security force there guaranteeing peace, manned by NATO country forces, continued arms sales by the United States to Ukraine, continued security funding to purchase those arms sales from the United States and Europe, from the Europeans, and that's gonna take 2 or 3 or 4 months, I think, of pressure on Putin. I don't think he's going to accept it right away. Now things can change. A bad battlefield turn for him, some other unusual issue, things can change. But I think, given conditions as they are today, this is 60 or 90 days away, not 6 or 9 days away.
Now, let me ask you this. Which of the Russian demands should America not accept?
Well, certainly, I wouldn't want to pick. This is like saying, which of my children don't I like? I mean, these are all bad demands, right? So we're going to have NATO forces in there. There's no one else that could keep the peace. We're not going to keep the peace with Nigerian forces or Chinese forces. We're going to keep the peace with UK and French forces, supported by Eastern European, Poland, a few others, some of the Scandinavians. That's number one. That's going to happen, and we will not give it on that. Second, we have to be able to rearm Ukraine, because we know Russia's going to rearm. Russia's going to take advantage of the cessation of hostilities to sell fossil fuels, continue to get money in, continue to spend 40%, 45% of their federal spending on defense, and they're going to buy weapons. Ukraine's going to have to do the same thing. So from my perspective, those are the two biggest concessions that Russia wants, and they're not going to get either one of them.
And what about those security guarantees for Ukraine?
So I think the only security guarantee they'll get are the forces. I don't think they'll get a path to NATO. They should, but they won't. One of the reasons they won't is the United States foolishly has negotiated with the Ukrainians in public ahead of time. And then you had the uncomfortable meeting at the White House, which should never have happened. President Zelensky is a heroic leader, but he's also a blunt speaker, and that was not going to go well with President Trump. He should have signed the mineral deal in Kiev and continued to fight the war from Kiev, mailed it in with an emissary. It happened, though, and so we're at this point, but negotiating in public really makes things hard. And I think NATO they should join NATO, but I don't think they'll join NATO during President Trump's presidency.
Thank you so much, Rear Admiral retired Mark Montgomery, for all your insights here on World Talks. Thanks for being with us here this evening.
Thank you for having me.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skye, but don't go away. News up next.